Rome was watching the sea. But in 218 BC, Hannibal of Carthage came from the mountains, leading an army into a place where armies were never meant to survive. Through the high Alps, his soldiers moved along paths so narrow and so exposed that a single mistake could send men and animals into the void below. At their head stood Hannibal, the commander who believed that the only way to defeat Rome was to do what Rome thought was impossible. Far away, Roman eyes searched for danger in the usual places, not yet realizing that the real threat was gathering in the frozen silence above them. Then the mountains turned savage. Wind, snow, ice, and hunger began tearing at the army, testing every man, every beast, and every step forward. Even the elephants, the most shocking weapons in Hannibal's force, had to be dragged and guided across icy ledges where one slip could destroy the march. At night, the survivors huddled against the cold, surrounded by darkness, mountain wind, and the growing fear that the Alps might kill them before Rome ever could. But when the storm finally broke, Hannibal's army saw Italy below. They were battered, freezing, and reduced, but they had crossed the impossible road. Before Hannibal crossed the Alps, Rome and Carthage were already locked in a struggle for the Mediterranean. Carthage was rich, powerful, and built on the sea. Its ships carried trade, wealth, and influence across the ancient world. Rome was different. It was a republic of soldiers, senators, roads, discipline, and ambition. These two powers had fought before, and when the first war ended, neither side truly forgot the cost. Hannibal grew up in the shadow of that defeat, surrounded by commanders who believed Rome would return again and again. To Carthage, Rome was not just a rival. It was a growing force that could one day crush everything in its path. To Rome, Carthage was not just a city. It was a dangerous empire across the sea, wealthy enough to challenge Roman power. So when war came again, both sides understood what was at stake. But Hannibal did not want to fight Rome the way Rome expected. He would not simply sail across the sea and meet Rome on familiar ground. Instead, he prepared soldiers, horses, supplies, and elephants for a road so dangerous that his enemies barely imagined it was possible. Hannibal's plan was not only bold, it was almost unbelievable. Rome expected danger from the sea, from ports, from ships, and from the familiar routes of war. But Hannibal looked beyond the obvious path. He looked toward the land, toward Spain, toward the rivers, and finally toward the mountains. To his commanders, the route must have sounded impossible. Armies needed roads, armies needed food, armies needed safe passage. Hannibal was choosing the opposite. He was choosing distance, danger, hostile tribes, broken terrain, and the cold roof of Europe. His army had to become more than a fighting force. It had to become a moving city of men, animals, weapons, and supplies. The cavalry would give him speed, the infantry would give him strength, but the elephants would give him terror. Meanwhile, Roman eyes stayed fixed on the water. Rome knew how enemies crossed the sea. Rome knew how to defend the expected. That was the opening Hannibal needed. If he could survive the impossible road, He could appear where Rome felt safe. So at dawn, the army began to move, not toward comfort, not toward certainty, but toward the mountains waiting in the distance. The march began far from the snow, under warmer skies, across rough roads, dry hills, and hostile lands. At first, the army looked enormous. Infantry, cavalry, pack animals, supply carts, and elephants stretched across the road like a moving kingdom. But every mile took something from them. Food disappeared, animals tired, men fell behind. The road began collecting its price. Rivers slowed the march and turned simple movement into danger. Men fought the current while handlers struggled to keep the elephants calm. Mud trapped the carts. Supplies had to be dragged forward by hand, because without food and equipment, the army would die before battle. From the ridges, local tribes watched the Carthaginians pass. Some waited, some traded, some prepared to strike when the column was weak. Hannibal kept moving at the front because hesitation was dangerous. The longer the army stopped, the more enemies, hunger, and fear could gather. The soldiers rested when they could, but rest never lasted long. The campaign was becoming a test of endurance before it became a war. Through valleys and narrow roads, the army twisted forward, squeezed by cliffs, dust, animals, and the endless weight of its own ambition. Scouts rode ahead, searching for danger, water, and a path through lands that did not want this army to pass. Then the weather began to change. Warm dust gave way to colder wind, darker skies, and the first warning of what waited ahead. At last, the Alps rose before them, not as a road, but as a wall of stone, snow, and silence. The climb into the Alps changed everything. The army was no longer marching across land. It was fighting the mountain itself. The paths narrowed until men and animals moved one careful step at a time, with cliffs above them and empty air below. Then the mountains found new enemies for Hannibal. Tribal fighters appeared from the heights, striking from places no army could easily reach. Stones and spears came down from above. Shields rose in panic, and the long column broke into confusion on the narrow path. To keep moving, Hannibal's men had to fight uphill in snow and rock, against enemies who knew every ridge and hidden path. The elephants suffered too. On icy ledges, even their size became a danger, because one frightened step could pull men and animals down together. Hannibal had to hold the army together with will alone, urging exhausted soldiers forward, when the mountain seemed stronger than any enemy. At night there was little comfort. Small fires struggled against the cold, while men slept beside weapons, animals, and fear. Some paths were blocked, some were broken, some seemed to vanish into cliffs, forcing the army to carve its own way forward. Snowstorms swallowed the column, until men could barely see the soldiers in front of them. The wounded had to be carried. The weak had to be pushed onward. The march became less about victory and more about survival. When the road collapsed, the entire army stopped. Behind them was winter. Ahead of them was a gap that could end the campaign. So they rebuilt the path with stone, wood, earth, and desperation, because there was no other way through. Then came the test. One elephant crossed the repaired ledge while the army watched, knowing the road would live or die with that step. Higher up, the clouds began to break. For the first time, the soldiers could sense that another world waited beyond the mountains. But the descent was still deadly. Downward paths were slick, steep, and cruel, punishing men who had already survived too much. By the time they emerged from the worst of the snow, Hannibal's army was smaller, weaker, and scarred by the crossing. Yet from the ridge, Italy opened below them. The impossible had not killed them, and that was enough to change the war. The army descended from the Alps like survivors from another world, leaving snow behind for valleys, water, and the first signs of Italy. Men who had nearly frozen now reached streams and lower ground, but relief did not erase what the mountains had taken. The surviving elephants moved on with the reduced army, no longer just weapons of war, but proof that Hannibal had crossed the impossible. In the Italian countryside, people stared at the strange column coming down from the mountains, as if the Alps had opened and released an army. News traveled faster than the soldiers. Messengers rode hard across Italy, carrying a warning Rome had not expected to hear. Hannibal was not at sea. He was not waiting across the water. He was already inside Italy. Roman commanders looked at their maps and understood the disaster. The enemy had entered from the direction they had trusted most. Hannibal gathered his exhausted men and reminded them that survival itself had become a weapon. Roman scouts saw the truth with their own eyes. The army was damaged, but it was real. Then Hannibal moved deeper into Italy, and the war changed from a distant threat into a nightmare walking on Roman soil. Hannibal had not crossed the Alps just to survive. He had crossed them to make Rome bleed. At the Trebia River, winter itself seemed to fight beside him, as Roman soldiers moved through freezing water toward battle. Cold, tired, and exposed, the Romans entered the field while Hannibal's forces waited with patience and design. Carthaginian cavalry struck with speed, turning the battlefield into motion, pressure, and confusion. The Roman line tightened under attack, and Hannibal's army began showing the skill that made him so dangerous. Then came Lake Trasimene, where fog, hills, and water created the perfect trap. The Roman column marched into the mist, unaware that Hannibal's soldiers were waiting around them in silence. When the ambush erupted, the lake became a wall, the hills became weapons, and escape almost disappeared. Rome was stunned. Defeat followed defeat, and the Republic began to understand that Hannibal was not merely lucky. Then came Cannae, the battlefield that would make his name echo through military history. The Roman army pressed forward with confidence, believing its weight and numbers would crush the Carthaginian center. But Hannibal's line bent without breaking, drawing the Romans inward like a door closing behind them. Then the cavalry struck the rear, and the trap became complete. By the end, Rome had suffered one of the worst disasters in its history, and Hannibal stood as the enemy who had outthought an empire. Hannibal did not destroy Rome, but he gave Rome a fear it never forgot. His march over the Alps became more than a military maneuver. It became a symbol of impossible ambition. Long after the soldiers were gone, the mountain passes remained, silent witnesses to one of history's boldest gambles. Rome survived, but survival did not erase the shock of an enemy appearing from the mountains with elephants and war. In memory, the elephants became larger than weapons. They became the image of Hannibal's genius, danger, and defiance. Writers, soldiers, and historians kept returning to the story, trying to understand how one commander dared to choose that road. The Alps became part of the legend, not just as mountains, but as the barrier Hannibal refused to obey. And even now, the story still feels impossible. A general, an army, and elephants crossing the roof of Europe to strike Rome from behind.